Hello, my name is Roy Childs from Team Focus, and this video is to help you understand more about numbers. Now, I know that's not everyone's cup of tea, but I assume you're here because you've heard the word ipsative. This is usually in the context of psychometrics that measure personality, interest or values. So by starting this video, I guess you are either intellectually curious or you are driven by a deep need to be professional. And this means being knowledgeable enough to avoid the danger of misinterpreting scores and profiles. Not many people outside the world of psychometrics have heard the word ipsative, but by watching this video you will join the select band of people who have not only heard of it but also understand it. So let me begin. Let me introduce you to two very different characters. This is Ali. You may already be forming some impressions about him. And now let me introduce you to Joe. Whatever impressions that you've already made, let's give them a questionnaire to explore their interest in sport. Now I want my questionnaire to help me understand how interested a person is in football, running and tennis. And the most common method used in questionnaires is to rate each statement, like how interested are you in football? And let's suppose that Ali is passionate about football. He'd love to play it all day, every day. So he rates it 6. He also goes for a run regularly, but doesn't seem to have a passion for it. So he rates it 4. When he considers tennis, he realizes just how much he enjoys it, but it's not quite as high as football. And so he rates it 5. Now, when we ask the same question of Joe, let's suppose Joe is not very interested in sport at all, but he does watch some of the bigger football matches on TV, and so he rates it 3. However, he abhors the idea of running and he rates that as 1. He occasionally watches tennis, and so he decides to rate that 2. When we plot those results, and this is football, tennis and running, we get this picture, which clearly shows the differences between the two characters. Ignoring the issue of whether this was a good question and a good way to phrase it, that's a whole issue in itself, let's consider how some people simply choose a middle option most of the time. Perhaps they don't know or don't want to give too much away, but we end up with this picture. This lack of differentiation can be annoying, and it has made people seek alternative ways to get the information. One way to do that is to ask, of the 3 sports, which is the one a person would be most interested in and which one the least? And from what we know about Ali, he would clearly mark football the most and running the least, leaving tennis blank. Now we can score the questionnaire by giving 3 points for the most and 1 for the least, and it makes sense that the one marked in between, we give it a 2. Now let's ask Joe. We know he's not very sporty, but he at least occasionally watches a football match on TV, so let's say that he marks that one the most and running the least. The result, therefore, is exactly the same score as Ali. So when we plot their profiles using the 3-point scale, we can see how Ali and Joe have exactly the same profiles. Now the first method produces a profile which we can call normative, and the second method produces the profile which we call ipsative. Clearly, the normative profile shows the differences in Ali and Joe's interests, whereas the ipsative produces a profile that makes them look identical. The reason that they look identical is because the order or the hierarchy of interests is the same. It is the degree of interest which is different. So this is reminding us that the normative method is suitable for exploring differences between individuals, interpersonal differences, but the ipsative method is suitable for exploring differences within the person, intrapersonal differences. One thing to notice about these two profiles is the way in which the numbers relate to each other. If we add up the ratings for Ali, we get a total score of 15, and if we do the same for Joe, we get 6. However, the ipsative scoring, both Ali and Joe end up with the same number 6. In fact, one way to define ipsative scoring systems is that all the scores always add to a constant to the same number. This is because if you allocate a score to one sport or scale, you necessarily can't allocate it to a different sport or scale. In other words, as one goes up, the other has to go down. The scores on one scale are dependent on the scores on another, and this has significant implications for the way in which we interpret the psychometric questionnaires that use ipsative measures, because they violate the basic assumption underlying the correlation coefficient, which is that all the scores must be independent. So, whilst correlations from normative profiles can be interpreted in the traditional way, correlations from ipsative profiles are, well, let's just say that they are difficult to interpret. Of course, with either method you get differences such as the one shown here, but before trying to interpret it, you should ask yourself whether these are based on normative or on ipsative methodology. There is one more thing to consider before I summarise the key issues. So far, the examples have been simplistic with only 3 choices. Now clearly, the scores on the scales are highly related, because if I say most to football and least to running, then the tennis score is fixed in the middle. There's nowhere else for it to go. But if I add a 4th sport, then we are less sure of the relative positions of swimming and tennis. Perhaps they are like this, but they could be like this. And now, if I add a 5th sport, we are even less clear about the middle 3 choices. Perhaps they are as shown here, but they could be like this, or like this. A consequence is that adding more scales reduces the degree of interdependence between those scales. Some go as far as to say that with many scales we can treat and interpret ipsative numbers as if they were traditional ratings, and hence they go on to interpret the correlation coefficient in the normal way. However, others point out that whilst the degree of interdependence reduces, the issue is never completely eliminated. That's a clear voice of caution. So with more scales, it's argued that traditional psychometric indicators can be valid. However, let me put in another voice of caution, because the more scales we add, the greater there is of yet another issue. First, let me illustrate the most common ipsative format, QUADRADs. Using the sports example from earlier, it would mean presenting all the sports in groups of 4. When I use personality measurement, it could therefore look like this. Using the Big 5 personality language, this item is asking about you to choose between anxiety, conscientiousness, extroversion, and openness. But now let's suppose I have 8 scales, here illustrated by 8 different sports. How many quadrads would I need? To be confident about which is higher and lower, each sport should be offered with every other sport. And so we start with ABCD, and then ABCE, ABCF, ABCG, etc. And once I have done all the A's, I now start with the B's, and so on. So how many quadrads would I need? The answer is 70. 8 sports require 70 combinations to fully get the combinations for an accurate hierarchy. But now let's consider a personality questionnaire with 8 scales. There is no way we should be satisfied with one item asking, I am anxious. Anxiety is far more complicated than that. We would expect at least 6 items that sample different aspects of anxiety, such as I tend to worry a lot, or I sometimes find myself shaking, or I tend to bite my nails, etc. And if we only have 8 scales with, let's say, 6 items per scale, that would mean a questionnaire with nearly 200,000 items. Now imagine a questionnaire with 20 or 30 scales. Clearly this is not what publishers do. Instead, they sample certain combinations, but as we know, sampling 50, 100 or even just 200 from such a large number will leave very big gaps. Hence we never get a truly accurate ipsative hierarchy. And how good is the estimation? That is very hard to say. Before I go on to summarise, and in case you are wondering, here are some of the questionnaires that are clearly ipsative. We have Belbin and the Managing Team Roles Indicator, MTRI, which have 9 and 8 scales. But these use a different approach to obtaining the hierarchy. They present blocks of all 8 or 9 roles and invite you to allocate a fixed number of points between them, something I have not covered, but which is clearly ipsative. OPQ 32I, on the other hand, has got 32 scales and only 104 quadrads. So clearly a good deal of selective sampling of how these are put together. One that many people may be familiar with is the Thomas DISC system. There are many versions of the DISC system on the market and they only have 4 scales. The Thomas one has 24 items to try and cover that space. And a final point here is that the MBTI is often called ipsative. This is a shockingly common misconception. So I will just make the point strongly here, MBTI is not ipsative. There are other variations. There are things which we can call partially ipsative, like the Gordon Personal Profile and Inventory, and there are some tests and questionnaires like the Value-Based Indicator of Motivation or the Career Interest Inventory DODEC or WAVE, which combine ipsative and normative, often in a very interesting way. So let me summarise some key points regarding ipsative profiles. The first point is that the scales are interdependent, and so any use of a correlation coefficient to describe or justify the measure should be treated with great caution. The second point is that norms are not straightforward. Similar scores can mean great differences in degree, as explained earlier, and we can be left floundering with how to explain a normative score on an ipsative number. Consider explaining that my 10th percentile means that only 10% of a normative sample ranked their scale as far below their other scales as I did. I could still have a higher score than them in terms of degree, so ponder that one for a minute. The most important thing when using ipsative profiles, though, is not to take differences between people as being more or less in degree. We must be very careful about inferring differences between people. The summary of that is they are more suitable for intrapersonal differences than for interpersonal differences. And finally, multiple scales, yes, they can reduce some of the issues, but they do introduce new ones of their own. So I hope that has helped you to a better understanding of ipsativity. I've only covered one format, the quadrads, which asks for the most and least, but if you take the fundamental definition of ipsativity, which is that all scores sum to a constant, then any system that asks you to allocate a fixed number of points to a fixed number of scales will also be ipsative. I gave you examples of the Managing Team Roles Indicator, MTRI, or Belbin's Team Roles, but if you want to know more, you're welcome to inquire about enrolling on some of our courses. So thank you for listening.